Friends, we're moving immediately into another very important session. We have Song Richardson, who's going to be speaking to us. She is the Dean of the UC Irvine School of Law. She holds a chancellor professorship, the highest of awards that can be offered to a professor in the UC system. I'll be saying a little bit more about her in just a minute, but her topic is artificial intelligence and how that can reinforce societal bias. Now, all of you, we've been focusing on technology in China and elsewhere. If you go into a KFC in China, in many Chinese cities, you can pay with your face. The facial recognition system allows you to order your food and do this with facial recognition. We all use facial recognition to unlock phones, all of this sort of thing. And so we use also this artificial intelligence to improve the images. Some of you on Zoom have been clicking the Make Me Beautiful button, which can help. Obviously, in my case, there's no help possible. But artificial intelligence, these surveillance systems are also used in urban management. And we see this heavily used in law enforcement. If you're in Shanghai and you violate a traffic law in some intersections, you get a ticket in the mail, okay? But at least that is based on a very standard issue license plate. That's how they detect it. That's how they write to you. But what about facial recognition? And we see it increasingly used worldwide, including here in the United States. And you combine problems with artificial intelligence as it's being developed together with aggressive police practices, and you have a recipe for real problems. We have with us Professor Song Richardson, and she's worked across the United States. She's a leading scholar in criminal justice, which of course is always an important topic, but in this moment, in this place, it's essential. Everybody is focused on these kinds of questions. Her current research focuses on race and the intersections of race and law and policy. She's got experience as a public defender. She's worked for the NAACP. She's worked in immigration law. All of these issues that are very much in front of us, she has expertise in. And that expertise has been recognized not just by her peers, but by the wider community. She's received a number of honors, and it's a great honor to have her participate in today's workshop. Friends, wherever you are, put your hands together because we are really fortunate to have Dean Song Richardson with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clay. That was such a generous, remarkable introduction. I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today on the topic of AI and bias and how bias can be embedded in artificial intelligence systems. And the way I want to talk about it today is to first give you some understanding of the way that implicit or unconscious biases work. And the reason I want to start there is when we speak about AI being biased, what we're really talking about is how societal biases can get embedded in AI systems. So in some ways, when you think about AI bias, it's not that the systems are biased, it's that our society is biased. And those biases are embedded in everything, as I'll talk about in a moment, in our society. And then it gets picked up by the algorithms through machine learning. So where I want to begin then with all of you today in the I think I have about 15 minutes before I open it up to Q&A, is for all of you to experience a bit how little control you actually have over your minds. This is a lesson from unconscious bias literature. And the reason it's important is because it helps us to understand how it is that even if we ourselves are consciously egalitarian, how we might contribute to some of the disparities, the racial and gender disparities that we see shown in the algorithms of AI systems. So that's where I'm going to start, is bringing you into your heads and in your minds, and I'll ask for your participation. Then I'll share just a few studies of how these biases can influence our behaviors. And the reason I do that is our behaviors then create the data that gets embedded into these AI systems. And that's where I'll end, is talking about some of the ways that our biases get embedded in artificial intelligence systems and why we should be concerned about them. And then I'm happy during the Q&A to talk a little bit about what we should do about them. The final caveat before I begin is I rely on studies that demonstrate both how our brains work and how unconscious biases work. And most of these studies have bias too. And what I mean by that is most of the studies talk about how these unconscious biases impact people who are white and people who are Black. There are very few studies out there about the way in which these biases can impact members of the Asian community. And so we can make inferences based on the studies I'll show you. And I'm happy to talk about some of that too. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And we will start with me asking you to participate. So I want you to take a look at this slide and tell me, or raise your hand, I guess, because I won't be able to hear you, if you see triangles. And also tell me if you see the Star of David, if you know what the Star of David looks like. Now, if I could see you, and if you're like most audiences, when I show you this slide, almost everyone sees triangles. And if you know what the Star of David looks like, almost everyone sees that too. And the reason I start here is because if you see triangles or the Star of David, this tells you something about your minds. Your minds quickly, automatically, and unconsciously will fill in missing pieces, and you cannot stop your brain from doing that. So triangles aren't actually pictured in this slide, neither is the Star of David, but if you know those shapes, you will see them, and you can't unsee them. So that is one example of how little control we have over our minds. And now I want you to participate in this. This is a second demonstration. Here, I don't want you to read at all. All I want you to do is focus on the color, and then as quickly as possible, but avoiding error, I want you to say the color. So don't read, ignore the words, just say the color. And I would love it if you can do this out loud wherever you are. You can just whisper it if you want, but it's important for you to experience this, for you to actually do it out loud, even if you're whispering. So remember, don't read, but just whisper or shout the colors out, and I'll do it with you, okay? Don't read. Ready? Go. Red, yellow, blue, green, brown. So hopefully that was easy. We'll do it again. Blue, brown, red, yellow, green. Remember, don't read, just look at the color. Again, red, yellow, blue, green, brown. Blue, brown, red, yellow, green. I'm assuming this is easy for you like it is for me. So this is the final slide. Red, yellow, blue, green, brown. And then I'm not even going to embarrass myself by doing the second one. Okay, so this was really unfair of me to ask you to do, because once again, I asked your brain to do something that is impossible. You cannot stop yourself from reading if you know the language that I'm asking you not to read. So if this were in the language you didn't know, you would have been equally facile at doing this slide as the previous ones. But because you read, and you can't stop yourself from reading, your reaction time was slower, right? You stuttered a bit, like you heard me stutter a bit. And once again, that teaches you something about your brains. There are certain things we cannot control, like your brain's ability to read. We do the same thing with people. You cannot stop your brain from putting people into different categories automatically. And I'll speak more about that in just 1 second. And so when we talk about unconscious bias or implicit bias, it is just the automatic association your brains have learned to make about people in different groups. So what do our brains think? Even if you do not believe it consciously, our brains think that Black people are criminal and white people are innocent. Our brains think that women belong at home and men are leaders. Our brains think that Asians are really great at math and at science, but maybe not so great at the softer skills, right? So all the stereotypes that you know, that we know consciously, our brain learns through constant exposure. And these are where they come from, right? Our country, just from living, even watching cartoons, our brain learns to associate certain people, certain social groups with certain characteristics. It's identical, actually, to the way that algorithmic systems work, right? The way AI works. AI learns from data, and then the system creates algorithms, and you can think of your brain doing exactly the same thing. And so where does our brain learn these associations? The same way that AI learns them, right? So this was a magazine cover from a Delta flight I took. And what is my brain learning from seeing this? Men are leaders, right? That is how our brain works, even if we don't consciously believe it. So how does it work? Your brain's constantly, because it wants you to be able to navigate the world, it categorizes everything. So I noticed that most of you are sitting, and I would be willing to bet that none of you thought about the chair that you're sitting in. You didn't even have to think, what is this object and what do I do with it? Because your brain has learned to categorize things that look like chairs as things you sit on. And you want your brain to focus, to categorize that way so that you can use your conscious energies in your brain to focus on the work that you do, for instance. So much is going on in the background of your minds, and it influences you. So not only do we categorize things like chairs or pens or computers, you also categorize people. And what your brains have learned is that it is critically important to categorize a person by race first, within milliseconds. So every single one of your brains has already racially categorized me. It has determined, based on past experience, what race you think I am. Categorizes race first, gender second, and then a whole host of other categories. And it happens very quickly, within milliseconds. After that, so after your brains have characterized me, put me in a box, then whatever stereotypes you've learned and whatever beliefs you've learned, the stereotypes, or the feelings you have or should have, your brain learns, and you apply those attributes to me immediately. And the reason that's important is even if the stereotypes of me, so I'm going to tell your brains now what I am racially. It'll affect your brains now, right? So I am Black and I am Korean. So now your brain is trying to figure out which box is she more like, right? And then it's going to apply your beliefs and attitudes, and they are totally different. You know that, right? So if your brain thinks I'm Black, you're going to interpret my ambiguous behaviors, because that's when you don't have full data, that's when your brains fill in the missing pieces and then influence your behaviors. I'll show you some examples in a moment. But if you think I'm Black, it is the opposite of the stereotypes that you will have if you think I'm Asian, right? And so your brain has to choose, and then you're thinking about my behaviors and what I'm saying and whether you believe me or not. And all of this is happening unconsciously. So when we say something is implicit, what we mean is you can't control it. Just like you can't stop yourself from reading, your brain is doing these things all the time in the background, just like a computer system. When we talk about bias, you'll see all it means is these unconscious associations that our minds make influence us. So we treat certain people better, that's bias, and certain people worse, and that is bias too. It works in both directions. And then these associations get stronger and are activated more quickly the more we practice them. And when I talk about practice, I just mean like when you see that magazine cover I showed you earlier, right? Your brain is practicing the association. This is an older picture of me. I am, as I told you, my racial background, I was a civil rights lawyer. I think of myself as being completely fair and egalitarian. That's my self-concept. And yet, when I took something called the implicit association test, and I hope all of you will take it, I realized a decade ago that I, even though I'm Black, I have unconscious negative associations against Blacks, positive associations about whites. I prefer light-skinned people to dark-skinned people. I think women are not leaders and men are, unconsciously. And I was so disturbed by this that I had to learn, right? I took the test over and over and over, and I had to learn, how could it be that someone like me could have these biases that actually impact my own behaviors? So let me share a couple of studies showing the impact of these biases. So they sent out resumes that were identical except for the name, either a male's name or a female name. Sent it out to actual jobs. So identical resumes, it's just whether it was male or female. And they wanted to know I'm so sorry, I messed up with this slide. Same study, but it's the names. I'm gonna tell you about the gender one in a second. White sounding names and Black sounding names. That's what this study was, white versus Black, identical resumes. They wanted to know, would it influence callback interviews for jobs? And it did. So if you had a white sounding name, you were almost 1.5 times more likely to get a callback interview for a job than if you had a Black sounding name. Identical resumes. I should say one more thing here. Obviously, the conscious racist and bigot exists, but I don't believe that they are in the majority. And I'm not interested in what the bigot might do. I am interested in what we might do, what I might do. Getting a resume like this without realizing it, I would more likely call back someone with a white sounding name than a Black sounding name. Not on purpose, but because the way I interpret the resume is impacted by my unconscious bias. Same thing with gender. They did almost the identical study with gender. And both male and female hiring managers were more likely, the yellow line is the male candidate, the tan line is the female candidate, more likely to hire the male candidate, more likely to believe the male candidate was more competent, more likely to want to mentor the white versus the female candidate. Men and women did this, and then they offered the male candidate $3,000 more as a starting salary. And the reason I'm showing you this is these unconscious biases impact who gets hired, and then that creates the data that feeds into the AI systems, and then we see the bias come out the other end, right? That's how this system can work. Let me share one of the few studies that involved Asians, and this time it was a transcript of a deposition that 2 lawyers did, and they asked people, who would you hire? Who do you think is more articulate? Who would you refer to your friends? And the way they triggered unconscious bias was with a photo. They were both men, one was Asian, one was white. And what do you think happened? Even though it was the identical transcript, people thought that the white individual was more articulate, more persuasive, the one that they would tell their friends to hire. There are other studies involving Asians that have a recording of a deposition. It's the same recording all the time, right? But sometimes it's a Asian face, sometimes it's a white face. And what's remarkable is people will hear an accent and hear broken English when they see an Asian face versus a white face. That's how these unconscious biases can influence us. The reason I want to talk about performance evals that managers give of their employees, because once again, you can see, based on these studies, women are judged by whether or not they fit the stereotype, our unconscious stereotypes of how women should act versus how men should act, right? As you can see from some of this, women described as supportive, collaborative, helpful, critiqued for being quote unquote ambitious or aggressive or abrasive. And why am I showing you this? Because there are some AI systems that have been developed that use this data from performance evaluations to later determine who should be interviewed for a job. And if you're feeding in data from performance evals that contain the results of unconscious biases, you can see, once again, how bias gets embedded in these systems. Same thing with recommendation letters. Do you think this is a recommendation letter for a male candidate or a female candidate? A male candidate. This is a huge study. Men, in their recommendation letters, people use words like this and words like this for female candidates. And you'll see why, and that's important in a moment. So let me turn to AI. I'm almost done because I think I'm running out of time. There was one study involving an actual AI system, and they were training this system to understand the English language. And so you know that you train these systems with data, right? It's called machine learning. The system learns by itself once you give it a lot of data. So to help this system understand the English language, the data was just Google News for a particular period of time. Then researchers had a great idea. They wanted to see, what is the system learning in addition to understanding the English language? So they gave the system the IAT, the implicit association test I spoke about in the beginning. And what did the system learn just from reading Google News? Its algorithms from reading the news learned that Black individuals are bad, white individuals are good. Men are leaders, women aren't, right? And it just learned that from reading Google News, and our brains are learning the identical thing because our brains work in the same way. So this should not be surprising then. When Amazon decided that it would use an AI system to decide who it would hire in technical jobs, who it would bring back for interviews, it fed into the system the data from the people who already worked at Amazon, who were successful. And what it learned from that is the people they had hired before had resumes and recommendation letters that used words like captured and executed. So then when it was deciding the system who to bring back for interviews, it would downgrade resumes that didn't use words like captured and executed. And it ended up that it would also downgrade any resumes that had information about women. So if you were a woman, you were downgraded. If you had belonged to a women's chess club, you were downgraded. Why? Because in the past, there weren't very many women working in the technical areas of Amazon. The system learned that, and when it's reviewing new resumes, it put them at the bottom. Same thing happened with LinkedIn. Both of them stopped using the system when they realized that. But often, when we speak about AI and bias, what we try to do is find ways to reduce the bias in the system. And that can be problematic too, for a reason I'll talk about in a moment. But so where do these biases come from? Sometimes, and Clay talked about facial recognition, right? Facial recognition software, at least it used to in the very beginning, didn't recognize Black faces, especially Black female faces. Why? Because many of the people changing the systems were white men. And when they were training the system, they would use their own photos and photos of their friends who also happened to be white men. So the system got really good at recognizing white men, but couldn't recognize Black women. because it hadn't been trained. And sometimes the training data itself embeds bias in the very ways I just talked about, right? If you're basing data on the past, and you have to, that's where data comes from. And if the past data is biased because of explicit conscious bias or unconscious bias, that gets embedded into these systems and creates the biased outputs. Sometimes the issue is you're not using or building these systems yourselves. Because maybe you can control the data that way, but third-party vendors who won't share with you what data they used, that data can be biased. And then you don't know how diverse was the team that was choosing the training data. Because at least if you have a diverse team, they'll recognize if there are some missing pieces in the data. But it's difficult when you're using a third-party vendor to have the answers to these questions, because often the algorithms themselves are proprietary and you won't even know what the training data was. And on top of all of this, even if you know exactly what the training data is, nobody understands how the system actually works, right? What associations it's making, because it's so quick and it sees connections our brains cannot see. That's called the black box problem. And the reason the black box problem is important is because even if you decided you wanted to remove all the demographic information from the data, so no mention of race, no mention of gender, the system will learn that certain zip codes are associated with certain races. And then you'll see the bias anyway, without even realizing that it's racially biased, gender biased, or any other sort of bias, because we actually don't know how the system is making its decisions and what associations it's making. So I'll end here, and the broad point then is when we think about using these systems to make decisions, it is challenging to figure out what do we do with the fact that some of the outputs might be biased because it is making connections based on historical data to make future decisions. And that's how these biases can be embedded in these systems. So thank you so much for your attention. And I'm very happy to talk about any of this and answer any questions people might have.
Well, this was fantastic. You've raised so many interesting questions. And the place where I begin with it is we're in a prison. We are in a prison. And the prison is the past.
Yes.
Right? As individuals, so two things. One is that prison, that the past is the funnel through which we try to understand where we are and where we want to be. But also, artificial intelligence is too much like our own intelligence.
Exactly. Yeah.
That it has exactly the same limitations, that it has the information that has come in through, maybe more experience than I as an individual possess, but right, that we collectively possess. And your example from Amazon, basically making sure that they hire exactly the same people they've hired before by teaching the machine, this is what we want, how that reinforces it. This is really, really powerful. Can you say something more about, as a species, we've evolved to
Yes,
process information, and we work from the general to the specific. And
yes,
could you say something more about that, and why
absolutely,
then it's so hard to break out of that?
Absolutely, right. And so our brains, to take the analogy even further, our brains are like computer systems, right? Like that is what it does. And so that's one piece to understand. The second piece to understand is our brains like to conserve energy, right? They're cognitive misers, right? So they want to save as much energy as possible so that we can use the energy we need to focus on whatever important piece of work is in front of us at the moment. So our brains have evolved then to do a lot of things quickly and unconsciously, right? And it does that, and we're happy it does that, right? Like you want it to do that, right? Like if you're walking down the street and then you see a tiger or something like that, right? Or a wolf, you don't want to have to think a lot about, is that a danger to me, right? You just want to run, and your brain knows that it'll just make you run very quickly. Or if I had a glass of water and I threw, the water at you, you would automatically move away quickly without thinking about it. It's like instinctual. And you want your brain to do that, because imagine how difficult it would be if you had to relearn everything, right? Like relearn what a chair is before you knew what to do about it. Like you wouldn't be able to function at all. So our brains are very efficient that way, which is why most of us, not all of us, but most of us, even me, my brain is constantly learning these unconscious associations because it should. So I can navigate the world quickly, understand things quickly. But that's also where the problem happens, right? Because if we're not aware of it, if we don't think about it, we're just going to act on it. Even me, right? Like even as a Black woman, a Korean woman, I will act on it in ways that would be so offensive to me if I knew I was doing it. So that's kind of the way to think about the way our brains work. It's always going to fill in those missing pieces. And if we're not paying attention, it can lead to biased behaviors.
And this is so vital in, with artificial intelligence, moving towards autonomous vehicles. We want the vehicle to recognize this is a pedestrian.
Yes.
This is a kid chasing a ball. Stop the car. So we need that. But you've made the point here that with artificial intelligence, it's one thing for you or me walking down the street to process things based on our own experiences, that sort of thing. But with artificial intelligence, you're taking experiences, perceptions from this broader universe. And that's the societal bias that you're talking about.
Exactly. I wanted to raise one thing because you mentioned autonomous vehicles, right? Which is so fraught, because here's what I mean by that. At least when we're driving, right? And we see a ball come across the road, a kid walking across the road, we make a split second, almost unconscious decision to stop. With AI and autonomous vehicles, though, we have to make those decisions and program those decisions, not even program, but think about those decisions prior to anything happening. So now you have to make a decision of, if the autonomous vehicle has to either kill me or the 5 people I'm about to hit, how do we want to train that machine to make that decision? And most of us would say, not most of it, when they did these studies asking a bunch of people about that, most people say, save me. Not the 5 people. Right? So it's like all of these decisions that we now have to make at the front end, ex ante, instead of right at the moment. So it's fascinating to me.
Well, that's, the bad judgment, to take it away from, killing somebody, as opposed to, do I run over the squirrel or do I keep the school bus on the road? Kind of thing, right?
Right, exactly.
And this sort of calculation. And as you say, the machine learning, the artificial intelligence has to anticipate these things.
Right.
And so that filters in. Now we've got a couple of questions already in the Q&A section that are in some ways similar. And, you're talking to a group primarily of teachers. And so we all, teachers have been, exposed to some of this research about how the bias that many people have towards a particular, race, religion, gender, height, attractiveness, all of the things,
all of it,
all of the potential prejudices a person can have. And, and they're told, you got to be aware that you carry this into the classroom. And we've got a couple of people, one teacher has asked, okay, how do I because these studies mainly reveal, many of them reveal, this white preference, this
Yep.
white, the assumption that leaders are whites,
Mhm.
right? That sort of thing. But how do I work with students of color, females, that sort of thing? And then we have another question looking at how do we learn to see the individual? How do we learn to get beyond, the generalization? How do we escape our prison?
Oh, these are such important and great questions. And I didn't get a chance to go into all of the ways that we can try. So this gives me the opportunity to at least talk about how can we overcome these biases in our own minds, let alone in AI, right? So I guess where I'll start to answer that is first to say, I don't think that we are culpable, guilty for having these unconscious associations, because it is so hard living in this society to not have them. Like I gave you the Google News example, right? So for me though, we are culpable if we don't figure out how do we safeguard ourselves from acting on them, which is essentially what some of the questions that you gave me are. So let me talk about some of the things we can do that lead from easy to potentially more difficult. Easy is first, and maybe not so easy, just being aware of the fact that you have them can make you more careful. And so slowing down, not acting on autopilot. So let's say, for instance, you are grading papers and it's not blind grading. You actually know who the students are. Your brain is going to then bring in its explicit and implicit biases. If you are aware that you can be impacted by viewing more carefully the report written by a Black student versus a white student, this is based on a study, you will find more errors in the Black student's paper versus the white student's paper, even though they have the identical errors embedded in them. So if you are grading these papers when you're busy, when you're hungry, when you're under time pressure, when you're multitasking, your brain will be affected.
I don't know if we've just lost Dean Song Richardson. While our IT folks work to restore her, we can talk a little bit. So many different questions have been raised here, right? How do we escape the prison of ourself, our own experiences and our biases? Dean Song Richardson was talking about bias in grading. And from my personal experience, I know that the place where I am most liable to be biased is at the end of a stack of papers that you try really hard to apply the same standards to the first paper as you do to the last.
So sorry about that. I'm back.
No problem, and we are glad. Thank you. I was just explaining that in grading papers, one of the biases that I have is the papers that I grade later in the process may not get the same evaluation as ones earlier in the process. In my case, maybe my expectations get beaten down, and the right thing to do is to go back and regrade everything. And I have to confess, I don't always do that.
I'm so sorry. I'm moving to get better internet. I hope this will help. Can you hear me?
We can.
Perfect. I'm moving closer to my internet, so hopefully this won't happen again. Okay, I am ready. So I think I was answering a question.
Well, you were talking, you were saying, first of all, that we're not going to hold you culpable because you are biased. but we will hold you culpable if you act on that bias. That you have a responsibility to be mindful of the limitations and to do something about it.
Yes, and part of that also requires, for instance, we don't know what unconscious biases we have. So even collecting data can help, right? Collecting data of decisions that you have made vis-a-vis students throughout the course of a year, and then looking at your data at the end of the year to see, are there racial disparities here or gender disparities here? And if there are, then that sometimes is a signal, right, that we might have been impacted by our unconscious biases. Or if you're writing recommendation letters for students, if you remind yourself, there are unconscious biases when I write a recommendation letter, they have found it can eliminate the impact of those biases on your written recommendation letter, right? So sometimes just even being aware of it, slowing down, gathering more information can be helpful. And I want to share one story because this was told by a teacher yesterday at a training, a professor who I gave this hour-long training on implicit bias, and he started thinking back on his grading that semester. And he said in class, mostly white, 2 African-American men, one of the African-American men was very, very vocal, participated all the time in class, etc. End of the semester, he grades all the exams blind. But in his head, he had an image of which students would be the top students in the class. He graded all the exams, he got the top students, and one of the top students, of the top 2 students, was the African-American student. What he realized, though, is when he was picturing in his mind who the top students would be, none of the Black students were in his mind as the top student, even though they performed so well during the year. And that really made him sit back and reflect. Why was that? Right? And his unconscious bias that he has now made conscious was he was unconsciously thinking Black students aren't as smart. So despite the contrary evidence, he was impacted by it. But luckily, the grading was blind. So it didn't impact the actual grade itself. And sometimes those are things you can do. Can you figure out a way to blind yourself to the race of the students you are grading, right? And there are other things you can also try to do, but I wanted you to just know broadly, slowing down, getting more information so it's not as ambiguous, thinking about the impact that these biases might have so you can try to correct for it. These are some of the things that you can do.
And that's a wonderful example of how, through blind evaluation, you can actually discover, how your brain is working on this stuff and get at the assumptions that you might have. Now, one of the things that has come up in the Q&A, though, is, most at the pre-collegiate level, a lot of what you're evaluated on can't be done blind. It's presentations, it's participation, it's things like that.
Yes.
What can we do to improve outcomes, to, again, make people more conscious is the first thing of the blinders that they have on, but what else can we do?
So some of the things that you can do are, before a presentation ever happens, what are and you're a teacher, so I'm sure you do this already, what are the metrics that I think are the important metrics to judge someone's presentation? When thinking about those metrics, though, sometimes we think those metrics are objective, don't allow subjectivity, but they often do, right? So things like articulate, that seems like something that's not subjective, but it is, because we will hear things through the prism of our unconscious bias. So it's also looking at each of the factors that you have asking yourself, is this truly objective? And it's hard to be truly objective. I'm not saying that this is an easy thing to do at all, but even being conscious of the fact that the way you judge how articulate someone is, how persuasive they are, if you start thinking that way, it can at least help you try to put more information into that box that you are going to use to grade your student, because that's what you're looking for. Don't let your brains go on autopilot and just fill in the missing pieces. What you're looking for is, how can I add more pieces of information, more factors to consider? And by doing that, you can reduce some of the unconscious biases that you have. But let me share one more thing, because I didn't get into stereotype threat and racial anxiety, and these are all other things that can impact teachers. But when it comes to having conversations, here's what some studies show. When a minority in your class, it doesn't matter what racial minority it is, if they are in the minority, you are more likely to attribute, and then let's say they're mischievous people. So 2 Black individuals in your class, one gets in trouble, and then you have another Black individual get in trouble. What we in our minds tend to do is combine them as if they're one person, so that the second Black individual who got in trouble for the first time receives disproportionate punishment, because you're treating him as if this was the second time he had done it. And you are more likely to attribute that misbehavior to the Black individual's person and character versus the situation. You do the opposite when you're dealing with a majority member. You don't attribute one person's bad actions to the other, and you attribute it more to, not that this is a bad kid, but rather there's something about the situation that made him or her act out, right? And so these are other ways that our biases can get embedded as teachers, because you're teachers, I'm a teacher. I am so concerned about these issues all the time. I'm so concerned I'm going to call on male students more than female students. I'm so concerned that I'm going to take what male students say, even if it's not well thought out yet, because these studies show it, as, oh, he really knows this, he just didn't articulate it well, versus a female student who says exactly the same thing. Our brains say, she really doesn't get it, right? She doesn't get the benefit of the doubt that male students get. So once again, these are the ways our biases work. And if we're aware of that, we can attempt to correct for that. So I don't take volunteers anymore in my classes. I call on people and I make a check mark just to make sure that I'm not acting on my unconscious biases and calling on men more than women, for instance. So now, it's a struggle, it's hard.
No, it absolutely is. And as you say, kind of bringing people into the conversation deliberately, yes, as opposed to leaving it to some kind of chance. Yes. You're comfortable raising your hand. You've been doing that since kindergarten. You've got this, as opposed to, yes, and we're trying to bring in these different voices. And one of the things that somebody else has mentioned is language. Mm-hmm. And I know that I have a both conscious and unconscious bias. If you say nonsense, but with a British accent, I'll give you a little bit easier pass. Exactly. I have no idea where this came from, but it exists.
I love that example. My husband and I are always talking about that. The people on TV, there's so many now, right? With the British accents, like you just imagine they're brilliant and smart, right?
Yeah,
it's true.
This particular bias, and Miranda in the Q&A mentions that she uses a Harvard standardized test with her students to get them thinking about this process. And Dan of 1990, he says, okay, we know bias exists. How can we fix the AI? How can we fix artificial intelligence? How can we get it to slow down, think about where this track started, and be aware that it doesn't have to go there?
I love that question, right? So I was speaking to one of the developers of the Watson computer, and we were talking about AI and bias and implicit bias, and he said exactly what you just said in the question, which is, his answer was, why don't we just train the AI to recognize when biased decisions are being made? I was like, wow, of course, absolutely, yes, right? So there are people working on doing that. But I will say something with regard, so I think that that's definitely important, but the other part of it that is somewhat disturbing to me though, is while I agree that we should try to root out bias in this way and maybe have AI help us make unbiased decisions, I also don't want to mask the fact that these biases exist in the first place. And so part of me loves, that's too strong a word, if we thought about using these systems to unearth biases we might not even know exist, that is also a powerful tool, right? So if we decided specifically to use a system like Amazon or LinkedIn used, not because we're actually going to hire people from it, but to understand what biases may already exist in the environment that we were unaware of, which we should be thinking about to help correct, that is another powerful way, I think, of using biased AI to help us uncover biases that may already exist in a particular environment.
No, that's how, trying to, again, plug this information in and trying to correct for, the power of the machine is that it can deal with a lot of information quickly, right? So, so that's, and trying to say, okay, maybe don't always deal with it in this way, this sort of thing. Now, we've got a couple of other questions. Mm-hmm. While you were speaking, I was thinking, I go back to Brown versus Board of Education.
Yes.
And
all studies.
Yeah, and exactly, the doll studies. Mm-hmm. And the most compelling thing is you even get the African-American kid to identify the white doll as bird or better or something like that. And one of our teachers in the Q&A has raised this question, mm-hmm. To what extent has research been done, and what does that research show about how people who are female or ethnic minorities, how the biases that they bring to the discussion?
Exactly. Such a great question. And so this is a topic of a whole additional conversation, but let me just share some of that research. So just like me, I'm Black, I have those biases myself, just like the kids in the doll study. But here's an additional piece that I think is really important to think about, and that's stereotype threat. So what is stereotype threat? I think probably all of you know about it, but just in case, right? So do you, or should I quickly describe it?
Please go ahead and
describe it.
Map that out as quickly as you can.
Yeah, okay, I will. So stereotype threat is when you belong to a group that is negatively stereotyped. It can work the opposite way too, but I'll talk about negatively stereotyped. And then you are doing something difficult in an area you care about. So I'll give you an example. I am a math major. I care about math. I want to do really well on a math test. And I know that there is the stereotype that because I'm a woman or because I'm Black, I'm not good at math and science. Right. So what happens when I take the test is part of my brain is focused on the difficulty of the test. And part of my brain is worried that if I don't do well, I will confirm the stereotype that women, we're just not good at math. And they have shown in studies that that stereotype threat can cause people to underperform. And the reason they know you can underperform is if you change how you describe that test to say it is not diagnostic of how good you are at science and math, it's just to make something up. You get rid of those differences. And I'll share one study because I think it's intriguing and really demonstrates a point. They used in college Asian women to focus on this study. And in one set of studies, they told Asian women that this is, and these were all science majors who had done really well, right? So they said to them, this is diagnostic of how smart you are. And then they reminded one group that they were women. And they reminded the other group that they were Asian. When you reminded women that they were Asian before they took their test, their scores went up. Because that's called stereotype lift, stereotype boost. Asians are great at math. If you remind the same group that they're women, their scores went down. Because women are not good at math and science, right? It's like fascinating to me the way our brains work. So what that tells me when I'm giving tests, when I'm talking to students about the bar and other things, I tell them about these studies and I say, think about, right, like whatever part of your identity helps you. Think about the times when you've been really smart and very successful and did very well, right? Like think about those things before you take a difficult test, because that can help boost your performance. I mean, this is remarkable. What we say as teachers can impact how some of our students do. Right, even though they have that same aptitude. It's fascinating to me, all of it. Fascinating and disturbing at the same time.
No, it's incredibly powerful. And as you say, what conveying expectations, but only conveying positive expectations is key. Yeah, we've got, so much evidence. There is no math gene. There is no, and so,
Exactly.
Students, think, oh, okay, I'm Chinese, therefore I should be able to do this. But in fact, what we need to pound home is that if you work hard at something, it can be done. That success can be yours. And so that was the example you just gave, right?
Yes.
Remember that thing, whatever it was, musical instrument, a sport activity. Remember that thing that was difficult at first, but you stuck at it.
Exactly. That's the growth mindset piece too, right? It's like adding that whole literature to it, that our learning isn't static, our intelligence isn't static. You want failure so you can learn to do better. And here are examples in your own life where you've learned that, right? Like all of these lessons combine to help you as teachers, help me as a teacher, try to figure out how to address some of these really sticky problems so that everyone can live up to the potential that we know that they have, right? That's why all of you are here. Like that's what we care about. That's what we want to do. So.
Well, that's right. And I have to thank you for spending this time with us, drawing on research that's in different places and bringing it together in a way that's so compelling. You've really given all of us a lot to think about and a lot to do, right? It's not enough. We definitely have to think about this, but we have to act on it. Absolutely. And if we are really in your debt, we may not get to sit in your law school classroom anytime soon, but thank you for bringing all of this to us today. Friends, it's time to cheer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Have a great rest of the day.